It was just poverty. I want to get myself out of this space, and the only way to do it is me and me alone, because there's no one who's going to come and rescue me. And I must say, I've spent lots of time.
Dr Rufaro Inyakatawa,
founder and CEO of RDK Capital.
She has more than 20 years of experience in the finance sector, and she is looking to reshape the financial landscape of Africa.
All I knew was the only tool that I knew was education. I could not afford to fail. And I failed first year university.
Working for big corporates like Old Mutual, Netbank. What major lessons could you share with us?
I was so tired of being a statistician who sits in the corner. But maybe one of the biggest things, I think, for me was...
Do you think that all entrepreneurs should work at a bigger firm before starting their own business?
This is where, for me, I think the balance is quite important, because you can have a very great idea, but if you do not...
Dr. Rufaro, why do you do the work that you do? What drives you?
Wow, what a nice question. To be honest, for me, as someone who grew up in rural areas, right? And knowing, the change that we can make in the world. Like I said, it feels like, I think this is more like midlife crisis, where I've realized how we can make a difference in the communities that we live and in solving problems, especially being closer to those problems. We have an idea of how we can solve them. So with education and the networks that we develop as we grow older, I strongly feel that we can make a difference.
You mentioned that you grew up in rural areas.
Yeah.
So you grew up in Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
What is that environment like?
It was just poverty. What I can say is definitely I did not have shoes when I went to school. And I grew up in an environment where women are number two when it comes to education. And I still remember quite well where, let's say, a family struggling with fees, it's normally the boy child who gets first preference. So I think for me, that's what really drove me to work harder. I don't think I was the most intelligent person. Even as in today, I always share a lot about how mediocre I was. But I just applied myself because I could not foresee myself marrying a rural man and living in the rural areas, because life was very hard. So life was very hard. I did not want to live that life. So hence I worked hard from an academic perspective.
And how beneficial do you think that early childhood was in your development as you grew up? How did that affect your thoughts and beliefs?
It made me become very resilient, and I think that's why I became a linear person. And I always at times share with people that it's just unfortunate, because all I knew, the only tool that I knew was education. So hence I ended up with 4 degrees, because that's the only journey that I knew, right? I only knew the only way to get out of poverty was education. But if I knew what I now know now, I think I would have taken a very different path, because it's not so much about qualifications. It's really very much about knowing what you need to do and who you need to contact, because at times networks can really help you to scale yourself up.
And how were you able to progress and see education as a way out of rural neighborhoods and townships? And what was the difference for you compared to those that perhaps weren't as fortunate and still remain in those rural areas?
So when I was born, I stayed with my maternal grandparents, and I still remember I was very privileged as the last born in the family. But then when I was 10, that's when I went to live with my real parents. And they already had 2 boys, which were born without me being in the picture. There's a bit of history around it. But when I realized that I had to quickly grow and become a small mother in the house, because I had to help my mother look after my brothers in the rural areas, that's when I realized how hard life was. So I think that realization from a life of comfort, being cushioned and the last one in the family, to being a mini mother when the mother has gone maybe to the funeral or whatever, it really taught me that life was hard. And the only way for me to get out of that space was the only tool, which was education. And hence, I really pursued education. And I think being the firstborn as well, I think my father did not have a choice of whether to educate a son or not, because my brother who came after me was about 4 years younger. So the only thing that my father knew was this firstborn was doing well. So you couldn't just stop me in my tracks. And I just had to continue. So I think also going to boarding schools did help a lot. I went to girls' boarding schools, and hence there was a lot of competition at boarding schools. And I knew I was very good in sciences and mathematics. And even one of my friends reminded me at one of my birthdays when I was already this old, when she said, "Do you remember how you used to beat us in mathematics?" But anyway, I think I was just lucky to be good in numbers. But I think that part really did help. I think it took me away from trouble, especially at boarding schools, girls' boarding schools. There's nothing else that is here except academia. So I think that really helped. And also the fear of disappointing my father, because he was a real disciplinarian as well. So just as much as, hormones, they play with us, especially when you're in high school. But I also knew the consequences of not finishing school. Yeah.
It seems to me that there were 2 things. There was the fear of disappointing your father, and so that pushed you to succeed. And then using education as this tool to provide a better life for you and develop skills and get out of there. And I think that mindset at a young age definitely is beneficial, that some individuals perhaps don't get to experience or don't experience at that early stage, and it only comes later in life.
I think there was that, but what I can tell you as well is I failed first year university. And I failed because my hormones, they took over me, and I had a baby in first year university. And so I failed first year university, I had a child, and at that point, those consequences from my father really became very clear. There was no support, there was zero support. And the 1 year that whenever I look back, that determination, I was hanging on to it to say, I cannot allow myself to fail at this point, was that 1 year where I had to repeat without financial support, with a child. My mother was not allowed to look after my son. And I think for me, that was my most resilient year ever. And I think that failure really taught me a lot of what can go wrong. And I just didn't want to go back there. So I think for me, going through failure in some of the parts of my life, they taught me to find ways of finding solutions and getting over that failure and being able to get to the other end.
How did you manage the responsibilities?
It was really one of the toughest years, I must say, because I had to look for a temporary teaching job. But on one end, I had to attend class. I looked for a lady who was looking after my child. She was a small girl, and she knew there were months who go without me being able to pay, because I had to balance between paying her and me going to school. And it was just hard. That is all I can say. And I think that's why I could not afford to fail. Because I knew that once I pass during my repeat year, at least from second year onwards, I'll start getting the grant funding again, because we were funded at university during those days. I think 50% was grant funding and another 50% was a loan. So I knew that I can continue if I just manage that year. So yes, it was one of the toughest years. And I just had to sacrifice when my friends or my classmates were going to clubs. I did not even know how clubs look like, and I used to talk about it even when my kids are older. I say, I've never been to a club. I don't know how a club looks like, because I had to become a mother at a very early age.
You also spoke about resilience.
Yeah.
What is your definition of resilience, and how important is that quality for entrepreneurs?
My definition is really based on my experiences. So for me, it's about when things get tough, how do you still continue on that path? How do you not get distracted? How do you find other sources of inspiration to continue on the journey? And also tapping into networks. Because one thing that I've learned over time, and maybe now I'm a bit wiser as compared to even at that time, is there are people that are willing to help. There are people that are willing to share information without you paying for it. There are, but on the other hand, don't be distracted. It's really about setting those goals and say, where do I want to be? How do I get there? And definitely you have to fine tune that journey as you go along. The more you become wiser or you know more additional information, you can always fine tune whatever that strategy is. But it's about really making sacrifices. I mentioned about not going to clubs because I knew I had to pass. So we only have 24 hours in a day. And with 24 hours in a day, if one is clear about the goal, it's always quite important to say, this is all the time that I have. What do I have to cut out so that I can put more effort into what I want to achieve? And make sure that you go onto that path, look for support. And yeah, so resilience, it's really not derailing on your objective, but being very clear. And it's always very important to be very clear from day one. The reason why at times people fail or maybe they're not as resilient enough is either they were forced to do something which wasn't very close to their heart. Or, it might be they are doing it for the sake of doing because everybody else is doing it. But when that's the only thing that you have, and you know that's the only thing that is going to take you out of whether it's trouble or poverty or whatever that, bad situation is, it becomes quite important to be very clear in terms of this is the only way and how do I get there?
It almost seems as if the last part of that is you have no other option besides reaching that goal, besides getting out of poverty. And so you have to do whatever it takes. I think that's what I got from that explanation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it also talks to, even when I know I'm jumping, maybe you might even have a question for me at that point. But it also talks to a situation that I was in at some point in my career where I felt I was running on one spot for a couple of years. And at that point, it was more like, okay, you are continuing to run on this spot. You have been doing this for years and there's no way out. How do you get out of this space so that, there's a lot to give out there and one can grow and be excited about life again from a career? Again, it was more of I needed to do stuff. I started off with a SWOT analysis about myself and to say, who am I? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? What can I actually be? And, reimagining myself. And the more I did that, because I knew that if I don't do it, I was just going to continue running on that one spot. So that resilience of saying, I want to get myself out of this space. And the only way to do it is me and me alone. Because there's no one who's going to come and rescue me and become something different. So that for me, one is that passion to say, this, I'm going to do it. And it's not about waiting for someone to come and tell you what you need to do. So when it comes from inside, it becomes much easier to drive that passion and become very resilient, because you alone, you know what you need to do and where you need to get to. And maybe you're very passionate about that idea, or whatever that idea is. If one looks at an entrepreneur, if you're very passionate about it, you believe in it, you have read about it, you have seen other people that do it, and you strongly believe that you can do it, that's what you need. But if the passion is not as hot as that, the chances are high that, when anything seems like failure, you just fail because you just let go.
Giving up is failure.
Yeah.
Fast forward a bit, moving to South Africa and working for big corporates like Old Mutual, Nedbank. What did that environment teach you about the professional world, and what major lessons could you share with us from Old Mutual and Nedbank?
The reason why I started at Old Mutual is not because I wanted to join the financial services industry. I wanted to learn about management, because I was so tired of being a statistician who sits in the corner and someone wants reports and you give out reports. I remember there was a time when I sat down and I said, so in my 50s, if I continue at this rate, I'm going to have a young manager who's going to manage me, because I don't know what management is all about. So I needed to learn about management. So Old Mutual had an intern management program. That's how I joined Old Mutual. And they taught me a lot about the basics like planning and organizing. And if I look at just that basic planning and organizing, it's something that one takes for the rest of your life. It can be meetings that one needs to have with someone you prepare before you go for the meeting. It can be one wants to plan an event. You have to look at all the different aspects. So despite some of those skills appearing to be basics, for me, they've really become an investment into a professional that I've actually become. So there was a lot of planning and organizing, taught about leadership skills, managing people, really being able to engage with other people and come up with something productive at the end of the day. So it has taught me how to conduct myself in meetings, what to prepare whenever I need to have a meeting. Even when I was coming here, I had to really think through in terms of, why am I going there? What am I going to talk about? So that by the time when one is engaged, it's appropriate, it's what's required. You have done your research as well beforehand. But maybe one of the biggest things, I think for me, was to learn about the industry, because I grew a lot in the industry. I was in financial advice. If I look at when I went in there, I was a big rookie, like I said to you. But if I look at where I am now, which is about 25 years down the line, I'm now a certified financial planner, and I've been very much driving the Nedbank financial planning strategy. I really learned to export that financial planning expertise out of South Africa into other African countries. I learned to navigate the continent on my own without having a boss who takes me to go in. I had to learn to navigate dealing across cultures and say, we've got a lot of knowledge that we have, expertise in South Africa. How can we be able to package that expertise and share and export it, and for it to be used to change lives in the different countries as well? So it has taught me to really operate from whether I'm dealing with a cleaner to a senior executive in the boardroom. I remember when I used to be in West Africa, I would deal with people at any level. So there's a lot of the maturity that came over time, but also the professional expertise that I acquired over time as well, with that, because that's where I got my MBA. Was already at Old Mutual. When I became a certified financial planner, I was already at Nedbank, and even my PhD as well. So there's a lot of academia that came with it, but a lot of professional maturity.
In terms of those listed companies, how are they run, and what do they do to continue to innovate to ensure that, for example, their market share price doesn't drop?
Yeah. What I can say to you is there is a lot of professional, continuous development that happens in a lot of these organizations. And because you've got new people that come into organizations, whether it's at a low level or at a high level, they always come with some new ideas, right? And definitely, one is to assess the relevance of what they offer in the market and also the changing market dynamics. Think of the way technology has changed the way we do things. If I look at 25 years when I started in the industry to where we are now, there is a lot of development that has happened, especially in that space. I still remember when I started, I think we still used to go to the bank to go and withdraw money and change a few things that we needed to do. You still had to go to the bank, but now we don't do it. So for any company to be able to lead, it's very much how, what is your competitiveness, what your clients want. So it's always trying to listen to what clients want, what is new coming into the market, and what other markets are also doing. And also having new people come into the space, remember, they're coming from different professions, different markets, and different industries. They always come in with new ideas. So innovation is really part of what banks do and financial services generally.
It also sounds like with new recruits coming in at each level, they have strong systems in place that allows them to recruit and to implement at a fast pace to avoid possible disruption by a smaller fintech company coming up.
Yeah, because if you really look at whether it's not even just about big financial services industries, I think in any space, whether it's even a helper that comes to one's house, the chances of finding someone who has exactly the skills of someone who is left when you're replacing, it's normally, it's almost zero. So the chances are very high that whoever comes into a role, maybe they got 70%, and they've got another 30% that doesn't fit into that role. So that 30% is still part of that person, whoever is coming in. So that other 30% can still be used in different ways because that's how those people are wired, whoever that person is. So I strongly feel that it's not even just the financial services industry. In any industry, whenever one hires someone, one always knows that person will never have 100% that fit into the role. And at times you find that when one is hiring, you say, you know what, this part doesn't necessarily fit, but you know what, maybe it can actually help in this area into the future. So one cannot change how people think, but in summary, when people come into an organization, they only have a certain percentage of what the role requires, but they can always use the other knowledge or skills that they have to be able to change the dynamics and be innovative, and also depending on the departments as well. There is a lot of encouragement into innovation. If you look at the reward system, a lot of reward systems in different companies, especially in today's organizations, it needs to reward new ideas, innovation, and being creative. So a lot really drives the change that happen in organizations.
That's a really good point. Incentive drives behavior.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying is they have incentive structures in place that enhances and enables those employees and team members to essentially innovate because it's in their best interest, not just at the top level.
Yeah. So whether it's sales, whether it's support, I remember when I was at Nedbank, they used to have what was called natural born winners, where at the end of each year, one had to nominate people that we felt, they'd gone beyond the call of duty. So if one knows that they want to win because it's a 10-day offshore trip, one would work very hard to demonstrate whether it's in front of, because your peers are the ones that are going to nominate you because they believe you've done your work that you've demonstrated has gone beyond the call of duty. So it's not just your 100% that you are paid to do, but you went beyond. So that really, that entices people to work harder. And for me, I think what I also liked with that program is once one wins, on the trip you go with your partner. So it also, it's also showcasing to your family to say, you know what, even though at times I come a bit late at home, or at times I put in a bit of hours, but you know what, it pays off. My organization can see that I work hard and I bring a lot onto the table, and I bring myself to the table because I've got the company's interest at heart.
It also says a lot about the leadership of the company to have those incentive programs. Do you think that all entrepreneurs should work at either a large corporate or a bigger firm before starting their own business?
For me, there's a yes and a no. I think where the yes comes in, maybe to an older person like myself, I only got comfort to start something because I knew that I'd learned a lot of skills in the corporate space. It was more in a safe space where I've learned a lot about, all the different areas of the business, whether it's recruiting someone, whether it's, so it's your recruitment processes, it's how do you create processes within from an operational perspective, how do you create an end-to-end process. So there's a lot of areas and competencies that one gain working in a big corporate. And the companies normally pay for training because they want employees to be better, to be best at whatever they do, and they become part of you, right? If you attend those courses, and yeah, definitely, it can only make one grow and be better at whatever they do. So corporates are a very good training ground, and they polish us up. But where maybe for me it might be a bit tricky, depending on the innovation space, is at times when one works in the corporates, you know that there's going to be a salary at the end of the month to some extent. Yes, if you do well, maybe you qualify for this incentive program and maybe a bonus as well. So you don't necessarily have as many sleepless nights as an entrepreneur. So with an entrepreneur, so if you're an entrepreneur, so for me, going back to whether working for a corporate or not, so I still think when one starts on their own, let's say they haven't worked on a corporate, they've got some ideas, they can really go all out in terms of their idea generation, and they are not used to being limited in their thinking, because all they do is to really think about their ideas. They don't worry about at times the corporate restrictions that you tend to get in the corporates. But the only challenge, so this is where for me I think the balance is quite important, because you can have a very great idea, but if you do not understand in terms of, your business needs to be compliant, what does that mean? It means your business needs to be registered, you need to pay tax, you need someone who can do your financials every year or even every month. So it's about having all those processes in place for your business to have that license to continue to operate, right? It's also about, just as much as they've got an idea, you might need to put some processes around it. So you might need someone who's got an operational background to help you, whether it's document your policies and put all those processes together so that there's consistency. Because if it's a business where people are going to call in and you are going to recruit people, people need to understand what are the standard operating procedures. So at times you might not learn all those different aspects of the business if you've never been in corporate. So the advantage of corporate is it gives someone really the 360 degrees of running a business, because you understand different areas of the business. But it might not help you a lot with the creativity of the thinking out of the box. Whilst if you just come from an entrepreneurial perspective, but you have never been in corporate, you can be someone who's very great at idea generation and dreaming big, but you might not be able to really put a nice business plan together that is bankable. So one still needs both to be able to do well in future, unless if you can be the creative one and you bring a very good support system, people that can help you to manage your ideas, one can also do that.
It seems like on either way, there's wins and there's challenges. It's left up to you to decide on which path you're taking and really have that why behind each of the decisions that you make.
Yeah, I think that's why I think incubator programs, they do help, because you have great ideas, but you come through this funnel where there's a lot of panel beating in terms of how things really work. So it can really help to understand, yes, I've got great ideas. What do I need to run my business well? Okay, there's finances that needs to happen. There's some operation that needs to be in the business. There's some HR aspects. So to really understand what does the business involve and where do you start and what is the process around it and how do you make your business bankable. So I think for me personally, you need both. But on the other hand, if let's say someone has never worked in the corporate and has got a very great idea, I think it's quite important to be able to look for those platforms where they can be supported and grow their business.
You also did your PhD while you were working.
Yeah.
And your topic was strategies for South African companies to do businesses in other countries. What could you tell us in terms of your major lessons from what you came up with in your thesis?
Oh my God. Okay, before I go there,
Okay.
You can say, why did I think of that topic? So that was really the time when I felt I was running at one spot. And I realized that I wasn't going far in my career and I needed to reinvent myself. I remember when I did my MBA, and in our class, towards the end, my classmates were saying, now we have done our MBA, so now we need to do the PhD. And I said, I am not for PhD. I will never, and I even used the word never. To be honest, I think I've learned over time that word, I need to really use it sparingly because I never, ever thought I'll ever do a PhD. But when I realized that I was running on one spot, and I said to myself, if I just look at this, especially the South African corporate environment, I think I'm sitting at the bottom of the pile in terms of I'm just a black woman, a foreigner black woman, even though I've been here now 31 years. I'm kind of at the bottom of the pile. So what should I do for people to see that, I still have some brains and I can still bring something onto the table that is valuable? To be honest, I looked at all options and I realized that the only option for me to do was to study. And I also learned that when you study, especially when you do at a PhD level, you are going to be known for that thesis. That's what is going to define you. And for me, to be honest, looking at my background, looking at where I was at that point, that's when I decided, you know what? I'm going to be called Mama Africa. So what title do I need to do to qualify as Mama Africa? And for me, it was doing business in Africa. And doing business in Africa, what does it entail? It really entailed, one being able to navigate across the continent. And that idea really came about when I was in Nigeria, I think around 2013. And in fact, I'd done a lot of SADC countries in Southern Africa where I'd visited, as family, we used to visit with kids and my husband at that time. And then Nigeria came and I went to Nigeria and I saw some South African companies there. Some were doing well, others were battling, and we read it in the newspaper. So I think I got very fascinated in terms of those that are doing well, why are they doing so well? And those that are not doing well, what are their challenges? Because if I look, so I really got fascinated to a point. I said, you know what, I think this topic for me, it's gonna, help me achieve my wish of really participating in the economic development of the continent. If I can be that door opener who knows, in terms of what makes companies win and what make others lose, I can really become, a guide. I can show the light in terms of this is how things are done. And hence I decided on the topic. And the next challenge was to find a supervisor, because at universities at times you really struggle to get the supervisor who aligns with the topic. But I was lucky enough to find someone who was also very passionate about the continent. And and I think the journey was not as easy, because I was a strategist. Now coming back to write academia and strategy, they are very different things. It's not the same thing. So I struggled a bit, I think, when I started. But I think over time, I knew that I had to stick it out and get to the end of it. But, looking at South African companies expanding onto the continent. And why I decided on that topic as well is, if even as in today, statistics show that 8 out of 10 African companies, the largest companies that are operating on the continent, they're South African companies. If you are just to look at continental companies that are expanding onto the continent from a market cap perspective, most of the companies are South African. And it's because there's a lot of expertise, I think, especially in the financial services industry, and there are a lot of other industries as well that is really expanded onto the continent. So for me, it was really trying to understand, with this exporting of skills onto the continent and at times resources as well, what works and what doesn't work. So there are a lot of lessons. So if I just look at from a South African perspective, and it's also a lot in the academia anyway. So when companies expand outside their home country, they tend to start with neighboring countries. Because if you look at from a culture perspective, the cultures are very different. They are kind of similar. If I give you, for example, I can give you an example. Let's say if you look at between South Africa and Botswana, we've got Tswanas. They speak the same language across the border, right? The same applies to, if you look at, let's say, Lesotho and your Free State. They speak the same language. They are all Sothos, right? If you look at, so you find that across neighboring countries, you find that the populations normally speak the same language, the same culture, so it's much, much easier. And also, if you look at South Africa, it's from a population and even wealth, a lot as well as development, it's really a growth market in SADC. That's the biggest market, which means a lot of the neighboring countries, they actually come and import from South Africa. So if you, I don't know how much you've traveled, let's say, across SADC, especially neighboring countries, you find that there are a lot of South African companies that are, because it's much, much easier and people are familiar with the product. So it tends to start with neighboring countries. And then from neighboring countries, one then looks at language becomes one of the big ones, because it's easier to go into a country where, like South African companies, they would prefer to go into English-speaking countries because it's easier to navigate. You don't need an interpreter all the time. And then the next one is very much your growth markets. And what I mean by growth markets is, if you look at if you look at Africa, Kenya is kind of a growth market in the east. That's kind of the regional hub. Then if you go to the west, you kind of have Nigeria, and also Ghana, also really punches above its weight as well in that area. In Southern Africa, like I've said, differently, you've got South Africa, and when you go further north, you've got Egypt, Morocco there as well. So a lot of South African companies, they tend to go into, so it's mostly the eastern side of Africa and neighboring countries. Yes, west, where you've got, let's say, English-speaking countries. It's only now that some of them are exploring into French-speaking, but also if you look at a company like Sanlam, for example, they've done very well using their partnership model in a lot of the French speaking, because they've got a partner Saham in West Africa, which is very much in the French speaking countries. So they've done well. So if you're going to a partnership, it's much easier to mitigate over language. Yeah.
And in terms of RDK Capital, how did that start? What was your thinking behind?
My thinking was very much around, definitely I'm not going to start a company where I'm going to, let's say, sell product in a shop because I'm not good at it. I was not going to start a company where I go and put a flag anywhere. I just don't have. The only thing that I had was really my knowledge. So I felt the objective of doing my PhD was to acquire as much knowledge as I can so that I can become confident in terms of helping companies that want to expand onto the continent. So I'd acquired that knowledge through, initially it was the academia side, but also I was so privileged to have been seconded to West Africa when I was working for Nedbank, where I spent time in like Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, and I used to go to Namibia a lot. So my experience in the other African countries, when we were trying to help, those partners in those countries, gave me a lot of experience in terms of what does it mean when one is operating in a different country, how, the expertise that come in. So it was no longer just the academia, it was also the personal experience. So that personal experience and what I learned spending time in those markets was that I needed to be a go-to person in terms of those that want to expand more. There's a lot of knowledge that I learned in terms of if you want to have a partnership, you need to have a partner with similar values. You need to localize your product as well. You can't just copy and paste. That's why a lot of companies have failed. They took a product here, went wherever, just pasted the way they did it here, forgetting that there's a local culture and there's a way of doing in those countries. You can't just take your best manager in South Africa and put him into another country in Africa because in your world this is the best, because do they understand the local nuances? So many cases you actually need to look for a local person who understands how things work for your company to also do. So there's a lot that I've learned. So definitely RDK Capital, why I ended up having RDK Capital was creating a platform where companies that want to expand and they do not know how, they can come and ask, or even now I'm starting even to train some organizations as well that want, especially their senior leadership that do business outside the country, or maybe they might be managing a function which is across different countries. They are now starting to come and say, you know what, can we just sensitize us in terms of what happens in the different countries? And yeah.
And how do you find your customers? It seems like they come to you.
Yeah, so what I have learned over time, and I think it was when I spent time in other African countries, was that relationships are very important and social capital is there to be utilized. I'm very big on LinkedIn, but I'm also very big on building relationships. And what I've learned over time is there will always be people at times in our networks that we can reach out to that know someone or know someone in terms of at times what we want. So I've learned to really reach out to people. And also when your expertise is not questioned, people actually come to you as well. So I have had, so I've been approached a few times from what people see on LinkedIn, and they are asking whether I can help in so many different aspects. So there's that. I also have a website, but some of it is the what I've done before, where if I look at my first consulting job, it was someone that knew what I had studied and they knew the quality of work that I produced, who just, I remember he sent me a WhatsApp and he said, you know what, I've heard there's this company that is looking for what, and I know that you can do it. Someone wanted to, this company wants to expand onto the continent and they don't know where to start. And we were connected, we had discussions, and that's where I got my first consulting. I did not advertise anyway, but it was someone who knows. So for me, what I've learned over time, at times it's not about what we put on our websites. It's about how people know you and the quality of work that they do. Because at the end of the day, the work is going to be done by a person. So if people know the quality of work that one does in our day-to-day, the more people will still reach out to you because they know who you are, what you stand for, in the quality of work that you do. So at the moment, I'm not going to lie to you, I rarely go out there and punt. A lot is really my network. They know what I do. They refer me to someone. And if I look at like recently, part of the network, someone reached out for this, have a conversation. We were just discussing our own business stuff. This is what I do, this is what you do. And then the next minute, oh, you know what, with this part of what you do, I actually need to introduce you to a US network that is, that really trains leaders that come onto the continent. And maybe it's, so a lot really comes from conversations. It's not really something that I go out there and push and, yeah.
And the basis for your book, was it because you did your PhD and decided then to perhaps write a book and publish it? What was the why behind the book?
Because I was running on one sport, I realized that I have to be deliberate in what I want. When I decided to study, I was very clear in my vision where I wanted to be. And again, maybe it goes back to that word resilience that you asked me earlier. I became very clear in my mindset. Yes, I would know each and every step, but I knew where I wanted to get to. So even when I wrote, my proposal for my thesis, I said, I want to go into consulting. I want to write a book. I want to share information. I want to participate in the economic development of the continent. And the book for me was really a consolidation of what I knew by then, even though now I know more even after publishing the book. So it was what I knew then, the interviews that I had with a lot of these executives that I interviewed during my studies, my experiential learning across the continent. I met a couple of CEOs as well, some of them that I did ask a few questions. And yeah, so it was really that consolidation to say, I have knowledge, I need to share knowledge, because I normally hear a lot about, if you go to the graveyard, that's where, a lot of unfulfilled dreams are sitting. And one thing that I've learned over time is to say, what is it that I have to share now that someone can utilize on their journey? And I try to find a lot of platforms where I'm very deliberate in terms of sharing information, because one or two people might learn something out of it and it can help them in life, in carving their path.
Who would be your ideal reader?
For me, it's CEOs that are exploring the continent. It's managers that are managing different operations on the continent. It can be someone who is managing cross-border, business. Or even academics, someone who just wants to know what happens on the continent, or someone who is curious about the continent. But remember, Africa is the future. And because Africa is the future, you cannot not have ideas outside your home country, and Africa is not part of it if you want to succeed into the future. That's where we have got lots of problems. But on the other hand, If you look at, we've got a lot of natural resources. They talk a lot about our population is going to grow even more, and which means there are going to be people that can do the work. And so for me, I see Africa as the future, because if you look at, let's say in East Africa, mobile money, how mobile money is done so well, it's because the banking network wasn't that big, because it's not as developed, right? And I'm looking at East Africa, even Zimbabwe, where I come from. But you want, from a financial inclusion perspective, we want, like my mother who lives in the rural areas. Right now with mobile money, my brothers can send money to a phone. She can use a phone to buy something from her phone in the rural areas. She doesn't have to catch a bus to go into town to be able to get her money and use her money, right? So it means in Africa, we have got problems that can be solved by the future, by technology, by modernization. What in developed countries, they don't need the mobile money such, because, maybe they might have a bank, maybe almost in every street, or the environment that we've grown up with. So which means if people can dream big, Africa has the opportunities for people that dream big, that have got big ideas, because it's untapped. So for me, that's why I feel being able to participate on the continent is very important, whether it's writing a book, whether it's speaking. I tend to be invited to speak a lot, whether it's, I think I mentioned about the development program, but just being able to participate in the development of the continent. And because I strongly believe there are a lot of investors with money, but they do not know how to navigate the continent. On the other hand, we also have lots of problems on the continent, and we don't know how to tap into the money. So if we have people like myself, yourself, people that, that understand the continental issues and that know where to go, and maybe being able to connect capital, that's why I call it connecting capital to African opportunities. That's how we can solve Africa's problems. That's how we can give opportunities for those with money to also make money on the continent, but on the other hand, solving our problems.
What should entrepreneurs on this continent be doing to attract international investment?
So I strongly feel that they need to come up with bankable projects. So like I was saying earlier, you can have a brilliant idea, but if it's not packaged well, it will not attract investment. Again, if you are coming from corporate, yes, you know how things are done, but you don't have an excellent idea, it's also still not going to necessarily attract, money. So it's quite important to find that balance between a beautiful idea, package it nicely, because there are investors that are looking for opportunities to invest. So for me, it's about making sure that it's well packaged. Go out there and there are a lot of these accelerator programs. If one can, just in case you don't have the support, go out there. I actually know of a company. I met the head of business development yesterday, was saying what they're actually planning to do is to actually target first-time female fund managers on their journey to raise funds, right? In terms of what is it that you do. So really taking them through those steps. And there are a lot of such platforms. I'm not necessarily saying from a fund manager perspective, but look for platforms where you can learn more, because there are a lot of big corporates that want to give back. So they do create platforms where you can go and learn without necessarily having to pay money, because they want to give back. They want, like this morning I was listening on the radio where they were talking about, I think ShopRite and a couple of big international companies. They've actually come up with a fund where they are going to fund entrepreneurs in retail. So those that want to go into retail, there's this fund that they're going to create. So for me, be on the lookout for a lot of these platforms where you can learn without necessarily having to look for money to be better. And also find mentors. There are a lot of, those that have done it well, that are willing to handhold, and it's their way of giving back. Because if you look at the future, and especially those that have learned a lot, you find there's a lot about sustainability, there's a lot about impact, there's a lot about what is it that I can do to volunteer and help. So that's the culture that we are getting into. So it's a very different world as compared to, let's say, 10 years back, where it was one man for himself and God for ourselves. But the future for me is bright. A lot of leaders are very willing to give their time, especially to a great idea, and to see that it's realizable and it can create a huge impact, especially in the communities.
What advice do you have to female entrepreneurs or individuals who happen to be females that want to start businesses? They may be employees currently and they want to start a business. They have an idea, but they don't quite know how. Or it may be female founders who have a side hustle currently and they want to grow that and take it full time into a thriving business. What would you say to those individuals?
Let's not be scared. There's a lot of research that is out there that shows that, men, even if they don't know a lot, they are very confident and they can speak confidently about an idea that they don't know much about. And if, let's say, they're investors, they would tend to fund that man as compared to women. So even if a woman knows that area very well, at times it's our confidence level. So whatever you know, just know that it's good enough and it's important. And remember the world that we are going into now. If women do not necessarily participate, it means whatever is going to be created is created with a male mindset. And I'm not so sure whether it's going to save everybody into the future. So we need women to really participate, whether it's, starting a fund. But go out there again, like what I'd said earlier, but it's possible. Your dreams are very valid. And yes, at times, as women, the other challenge at times that we tend to have is because we also have kids, and at times we want to allow our maternal spaces to also evolve because, we are what we are feminine. And for me, I think the world after COVID, I love it more than the world before COVID, because I think the world after COVID has really taught us to just be ourselves, because now people are allowed to work from home. You are allowed to participate in your kids' activities, but it's really about you balancing your time. So as one can plan your world better, you can actually fulfill all the roles that you can do without necessarily worrying as much as we used to do before, because before you couldn't get to work at 10, but these days you might not even pitch at work because you're working from home. Whoever knows what you are doing at that time, nobody really knows. So today's world is really becoming an enabler in terms of being what you want to be. So find a women platform where you can participate. If I look at, like, in Jersey Finance, for example, what we have in August, because in South Africa we've got the Women's International Women's Day in March, which I celebrated well. I did a video on LinkedIn. But in August, it's very important for us to also celebrate women's activities. So Jersey Finance actually have 2 events. There's going to be one in Johannesburg, where it's a women in leadership event. We invite about 80 to 100, depending on the venue and all that other stuff, up to 100 women to one room, bring very inspiring leaders. If I look at, like, this year, there's going to be an ex-Miss South Africa who has done very, very well, who is going to be a keynote speaker. And what I'm liking about especially this year's event is, even though she's going to speak about a journey and she's in financial services, for example, I'm also bringing in the CEO of conscious companies. I did not know that there's a company called Conscious Companies, which brings a lot of ethical leadership into the room to say, you know what, when you get, at times things can be tough. How can you navigate when things are tough? So it's also giving them tools. If they are 10, they're also going to live with really tools to say, when things get tough, how do you do certain things in an ethical way? For credibility and a whole lot of other things. So find platforms where you can grow, where you can learn, and many of those platforms you do not necessarily have to pay for them. And find a mentor. I have a couple of mentees, and I still remember one of my mentee in Australia. I remember when she wrote a very nice LinkedIn post. I felt very humbled because she was in IT. She started a business during COVID, and we were linked up by Women in Tech because I'm also on the advisory board of Women in Tech, and I participate a lot in those activities where I mentor. And she spoke a lot about the chats that we used to have during COVID and how they encouraged her to really, to give her the confidence to leave the corporate, like we're saying. It started as a side hustle. And then through our chats, because I was also transitioning into my portfolio career, which I now have. And I think over time, she actually got the confidence to say, if Rufaro is much older, can transition into being an entrepreneur and actually into portfolio. I'm still very young. I think she was about 29. I can actually do this. And she's now started a business, generating money, but look for a mentor. Find someone who can assist you and give you a bit of that confidence for you to take that big leap.
Wise words. Thank you, Dr. Rufaro. This was very insightful. And also thank you for the impact that you're making. You are an inspiration to not only other female founders, but individuals on this continent, and you're doing big things. You've impacted the corporate world, and now you're making your impact throughout these emerging markets throughout Africa. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for your time and your valuable insights tonight.
Thank you very much.